You are listening to the Business Talk, a podcast where global voices in business, academia, and leadership come together to spark meaningful conversations. I'm Deepak, joining you from India. It's a true privilege to welcome Dr. N. Trumbore today as she joins us to share insights from her acclaimed book, The Teacher in the Machine, A Human History of Education Technology. Before we begin, let me introduce our today's guest. Dr. N. Trumbore served as the Chief Digital Learning Officer at the SENS Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. In this role, she leads the Institute's vision to expand access to world-class education and further Darden's mission of delivering transformational learning experiences to a global community of learners. Before joining Darden, Dr. N founded and directed Wharton Online at the University of Pennsylvania, building it into a strategic, revenue-generating digital learning initiative. Earlier in her career, she was among the early innovators at Coursera, NovoEd, and Stanford Online High School, helping shape the first wave of student-centered online education. Her pioneering contributions have influenced the evolving landscape of digital education and the future of work, reflected through numerous publications and her recent book, The Teacher in the Machine, A Human History of Education Technology, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Dr. N. Trumbore holds a AB from Brown University and MA from San Francisco State University and a PhD in education from the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a 2024-25 Stanford Futures Fellow. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. N. Trumbore to the conversation. Dr. N, we are deeply honored by your presence and thank you for accepting our gracious invitation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited that you enjoyed the book and I'm eager to talk about it with you.
Thank you. Dr. N, your book argues that today's hype around generative AI tutors and MOOCs isn't actually new. What surprised you most when you trace current EdTech enthusiasm back to experiments in the 1960s and 70s at Stanford, MIT, and the University of Illinois?
Yeah, so it was surprising how much the narrative or what we say about the technology has not changed in over 60 years. In fact, there is a piece on YouTube that I cite in the book that was a newscast, and the newscaster in 1966 said, "We're entering a new era of education where every student can have an individualized tutor," and that was 1966. And so then, in 2024, Saul Khan says the same thing, and they just don't, the stories don't change very much. But for some reason, we keep thinking that this next cycle is when we're going to actually be able to do it. So that was surprising. And the other piece that was surprising was that everybody assumes that this is the right thing to do, that is the desired state.
You describe the shift in US higher education from being treated as a public good to a private investment. How does that shift show up concretely in the way universities adopt and deploy education technologies today?
100%. So in the early days, so in the 1960s and into the 70s, universities experimented with education technology, but it was very research backed. And the companies, they may have been for profit, but they were not backed by public equity. They were not invested in by venture capital. I mean, they were really focused on creating a product that helped learning. That was the goal. And at the time, it didn't cost as much to attend college. And so, universities were sort of capped at how much they could charge because in the US, you couldn't borrow above a certain amount for student loans. That was capped. But then this story started in the culture that education was actually an investment in yourself, that it wasn't an investment in the public good. And that enabled some people to get very, very wealthy. And it allowed institutions to get very wealthy. Again, not all institutions, but some institutions to get very wealthy because people would say, oh, well, if I'm investing in myself, then I don't care what it costs. And education technology followed that trajectory. And so by the time you have the rise of MOOCs in particular, it's this idea of we're democratizing education. Wait, I thought education was a public good. Why does it suddenly need to be democratized? Well, it'd been turned into a private good. And this narrative about democratization was actually being funded by venture capitalists who were very interested in making a personal profit off of something that they were democratizing. So that was definitely a little bit of a contradiction there that was interesting and really fascinating to explore in the book.
One of the striking examples you mention in the book is AI tutors that can personalize instruction but can't do maths. What does
Yes.
that tell us about both the promise and the limits of AI in the classroom right now?
Yes. So again, so there are so many pieces to this question. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. So first of all, large language models are amazing. So I'm astounded by the technology. I think it's fantastic. And I am excited by the promise of it. That being said, there are limitations to them, which are now starting to come out a little bit more. I think people are getting, a better understanding that large language models are not good at everything. They're good at some things, but they're better at some things than others. They're becoming quite good at coding, for example. Reasoning, particularly mathematical reasoning, is still an issue. I don't know enough about large language models to be able to pinpoint exactly why. I know folks are working on it, but what's fascinating is that the claim that this technology was going to be used as an AI tutor, particularly for Khan Academy to teach math, and Khan Academy had to hire humans to actually check the answers, right? This is just, extending these claims, to capture mind share, and it wasn't true. And so I think the idea of innovation and the promise of these models, people just want to believe that this is going to solve a problem in education. And I'm increasingly beginning to think that, particularly for skills like numeracy and arithmetic, that, you know, people that's an inefficient thing, that it just needs to be inefficient. This is a capability that is inefficient to develop in some people, and that's okay. It's important enough that humans have literacy and numeracy, that however inefficient it is to develop those capabilities in people, we should be okay with that inefficiency, in the way that we're okay with inefficiency if someone has open heart surgery. It's going to take a long time. We're not trying to optimize that, right? Because it's important. And I think this rush to say, oh, AI tutors are going to solve the education problem really devalues, particularly at the younger grades, what education actually does and provides to people.
In the book, you connect generative AI, student loan debt, and declining public trust in higher education back to a common set of decisions at a few elite universities 50 years ago. Could you walk us through one of those decisions and its ripple effect today?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about student loan debt, I think, because that gets missed sometimes in the conversation around technology. Um, you know, MOOCs and the idea of broadcasting education and having education online for free or low cost would not have been taken up so enthusiastically if we did not have a student loan crisis. Um, and so, as I mentioned earlier, until 1992 and the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, students were capped at the amount of money you could borrow for a college education was capped. So even at the most expensive universities, their tuition didn't get really out of control, because otherwise they would not be able to attract a larger number of students. And I did the math on this, to go to, an Ivy League school in the late 80s cost about $48,000 today. They're now twice that amount, right? So, but that was in part because of the loan caps. And there were also more grants available from the federal government. So you had a broader sector of people at these schools from different economic classes. And you also did not have as many amenities, but it really there was more of a focus on this sort of public idea we're coming together and learning together. And then what happens is, as there's this rise of neoliberalism in America and this idea that that money is a profit can be made, and it's in the pursuit of good, right, all the time. That people should invest in themselves for education, and that the best way someone could serve their country, a young person could serve their country, was to invest in themselves, to become as educated as possible, and then go work for a company to create value that would then help the economy. Well, when you look at it that way, why not take out a loan for $70,000, right? Or for graduate school, $150,000 or $250,000, because you have it at a very attractive, it's underwritten by the federal government, you have it at a very attractive loan rate and interest rate, and you're benefiting society. And then 2008 happens. And there's this massive economic downturn. A lot of people go back to school because they can't get a job. They take out enormous amounts of debt, six figures and above. More than half of student loan debt in the US is for graduate school debt. And so suddenly you have a bunch of people in 2010, 2011, 2012 who are saying, I can't afford college, or I have $150,000 of student loan debt for a fiction degree or a degree in social work that I can't pay off. And that presents a market opportunity for low cost education delivered at scale. And so there is this very interesting idea. There was an idealism at Stanford, which is where I was, so I can speak to it. Like, there definitely was an idealism among the early employees at Coursera that really were going to do good for the world. And my, compatriots and peers at edX too, because we would, socialize. Also, we were very committed to this mission to make education available to the world. And what we didn't realize is that the venture capitalists and elite universities who were financing us saw the market opportunity in this idealism. And that was really one of the reasons I wrote the book. But none of that would have been possible if there hadn't been this public sentiment that college costs too much.
Dr. N, you had a front row seat in early stage roles at Coursera, NovoEd, and Stanford's online high school. How did living inside those experiments shape the way you wrote this human history of education technology versus a more traditional academic history?
Right. So I would say here are some great things about education technology. Many of the people in it are very, very committed and mission driven. Sometimes even more so than people on the traditional academic side. And they're really fun to be around. They're also very smart and they're innovative and they want to change things. And it's very exciting to be around people like that. Oftentimes, people in traditional education institutions want things to remain the same and are more traditionalist. I mean, these are vast generalizations, but there is a qualitative difference when you're at an ed tech firm versus an traditional higher ed, particularly higher ed structure. And then secondly, the folks in ed tech have more of a sense of agency. They feel like they can really make a difference because they're sort of one invention away from being able to create change for the better. That is sort of great. A similarity between the two groups is that both the people in EdTech and most staff and faculty at higher ed institutions, in my experience, are unaware of the power of vast financial maneuvers that are happening in the background. In ed tech, it's often private equity and venture capital. Actually, at some of the elite universities, it's those same people, except they're sitting on the boards of the universities. And they are also, moving things behind the scenes that are determining how fast, or not how fast, but where these institutions go. The big difference really is speed. An ed tech company, even a big ed tech company like Coursera is now, is like maybe a cruise ship. It can still turn pretty fast and maneuver pretty fast. You know, Stanford is an aircraft carrier, right? I mean, or a tanker. These are big. It takes a long time for them to turn. They make a decision and all sorts of mechanics have to happen and people have to run around and it takes a while. And so that's one of the main differences. So I would say to sum up, higher ed still slower. The people tend to be a little more conservative, meaning traditional and question change, and ed tech moves faster, and people are more eager for change. And there are good sides and bad sides for each model.
Many people still believe that free online courses from elite universities would democratize higher education. Looking back with a historical lens from your book, why did those democratizing promises fall short, and what did we overlook?
Sure. So they fell short because I don't think that free online courses can democratize education. Now, we thought that they could. And here's why. Um, and this is what I'm about to say has been replicated throughout history. So, um, you know, when people thought in 2011, when the very first MOOCs came out, before Coursera existed, there were three MOOCs that came out of Stanford, and they got hundreds of thousands of enrollments. Um, there was this idea that the content was gated, much like before digital technologies, libraries gated content, right? So for centuries, if you wanted to read Chaucer or study Shakespeare, you had to go to England and go to the British Library, right, to get the book. Like there was this idea that this content was gated. And it was a similar mindset towards higher education. Like, I don't know what happens at Princeton. Now I can just log onto my computer and see what happens at Princeton, right? And so it was a natural idea that it would follow, natural progression to think that, oh, well, this means that, this new technology can democratize education because it's going to make the content available. But education is much more than access to content. And that was the mistake we made, right? And part of the reason we make that mistake, I believe, is that most of these ed tech companies are staffed by people who did really well in school. And so for people who learn quite easily from having access to a book or a video and just really just want the content and I can learn on my own, access is sufficient to improve education. But for anybody who's ever struggled at anything or taught folks who, take a while to learn something, I used to teach writing and it doesn't matter how smart you are. Like sometimes it takes a while to learn how to write or to express something. Um, that is also education. And that's actually the part of education that technology cannot yet democratize. And that is the part that is time intensive, that requires human to human interaction, that is very inefficient. And so how are you going to democratize something that is at its core inefficient, right? That's where I think we just didn't see it, right? We sort of missed the boat.
The book weaves together interviews, archival research, and case studies. Was there a particular story or character from your research that fundamentally changed how you think about the teacher in the machine?
Yes, so it's funny because I knew so Pat Supes, who was the father of computer assisted instruction or adaptive learning, who hired me at Stanford. Um, I knew him. I had a personal relationship with him. He hired me to actually write the feedback that the machine would give, right, in an early EdTech product, a grammar program. Um, and so I knew Pat that from that perspective. And then I interviewed him a few months before he passed away about an experiment he did in Nicaragua in the 1970s, improving math instruction, actually using radio as an instructional technique. Um, and so that added another lens. But it wasn't until I fully wrote the book that I realized how ahead of his time he was, and also how people just get pushed to the side. Like he passed away right when I started at Coursera, and definitely everyone at Coursera from Stanford knew who Pat was, but there was just this willful ignoring of all of that work. And it was like, this is all the new work. And it was not done in a mean way. It was just that we had venture capitalists coming into this office. We're moving fast in this direction. And there was just no time to think or reflect. But so I sort of forgot about Pat. And then this all came up again. And I thought, wow, this is what we do. We keep overwriting people's histories to be able to capture market share again and again. And I'm pretty positive that unless we change dramatically in 20 years, no one's going to remember who Andrew Ng or Daphne Kohler or not Agarwal are, because their history will have been written over, by the next new thing. So I know that was like a couple case studies, but that was from a personal perspective, that really stuck with me. It's just how someone's legacy can really just be overwritten by, these financial forces.
You argue that following the money is essential to understanding EdTech's trajectory. When we look at who funds and controls these technologies, governments, venture capital, and universities, how does that financial logic shape what kinds of learning become possible and for whom?
Yes, absolutely. So uh, this is a loaded question. So one thing that struck me about the book is that in each of those realms, so finance, technology, and university, the people who are making decisions about the money are look very similar, and oftentimes are the same, but in some instances are the same people. Um, and so they're almost uniformly male, they're almost uniformly white, and they're all good students. They all did very, very well in school and have, generally multiple degrees from top schools. And they're very wealthy. So they've made a lot of money. So this speaks to each of them has an idea about education that is pretty homogenous. One, we touched on earlier, that if you just give people access to it, they will learn and take advantage of it. So they don't think about people who have barriers to education other than barriers of access. They don't think about people who might be dyslexic, who might have ADHD, who might have to work multiple jobs and aren't getting enough sleep, or have difficulty learning because there's not enough food. Like they literally they can't. That's not in their worldview. They also design education based on these ideas of efficiency, right? And optimization. Like it's always about improving. And improving in technology and improving in finance is about, at its core, particularly in technology, is about reducing friction. So I want to reduce friction between, when I'm calling using Uber, right? The least amount of friction, the fastest I can get from a finger tap to getting in the car, the better. That logic is not good for education. The fastest you can get from seeing a problem and solving it, actually, depending on what you're learning, might have to cause a ton of friction and be a little uncomfortable. So these are fundamentally in opposition. And so this idea that even MOOCs and free courses. I mean, when I look back, it was ridiculous. I mean, we had the best of intentions, but it was ridiculous. Like we were taking 14-week Princeton courses and filming these 20-minute or 30-minute lectures and putting them on the internet and having people write papers with no encouragement. I mean, it's just like, and then saying it was a failure that only 5% completed. Only 5% of applicants get into Princeton. I don't think that that's a failure, right? But we just we lost control of the narrative because we were putting out one very narrow slice or manner of education and pedagogy that has worked for people who have risen to the top of, the educational aptitude system. And that can't possibly, that's also in contradiction to democratizing education. So we democratized education for people who were already good students, but we did not democratize education for people who had barriers other than access to education. I mean, I would often say around that time that, if access to education was the problem that was holding back people from getting an education, then our library system should have solved this problem, right? Because that's what we were doing, was essentially the same thing. And we were presenting the same pedagogy, book, lecture-based content delivery, depending a lot on the individual to have learning happen in a dark place, right, which is between your ears. And the learner, if the learner can't do it, then you're not Stanford material, you're not Penn material, right? And that's not what democratizing education really is about.
Your narrative ultimately points toward a more equitable and collaborative pedagogical future. Based on the lessons of the last 50 years, what are the one or two practical design principles you believe institutions should follow when they adopt AI and other digital tools now?
Yes. So, first of all, I think technology is amazing in terms of helping us figure out what learning is, where it happens, and how we can deepen it. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for people to use these new technologies to understand, to better understand how learning happens. So that we can create the conditions for it to happen for more people. Um, a second piece is any way that technology can be used to support and enable human to human connection, which we know works, right? We do know that one person learning from another does work, or even one teacher learn 12 or 15 students learning from one teacher does work. So how do we use technology to enable those connections and to create the environment for those connections to happen where people might not have to be in a classroom together? I think that's very important. And then the third part is connection to content. We're overemphasizing that right now, but I do think that there's a lot of ability or a lot of potential in having using technology to provide access to different kinds of content and different kinds of curriculum and enabling different ways of expression that can be very useful. But that is putting almost the cart before the horse. That's what we're looking at right now. I think we need to really focus on some of the other components, particularly understanding better what learning is, how it happens, and the best way to measure it. And also, how do we use it to create connections before we immediately start trying to improve content delivery?
To end, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a university leader, an EdTech founder, and a skeptical student all together sat down with your book, what is the one misconception you would most want each of them to let go of? And what new question would you hope they start asking instead?
Yes. So the misconception I would like them to let go of is that any of this is new. It's not new. We're not in a brand new, we may be in a brand new world in that every day we wake up, we're in a brand new world because, things have happened. But these ideas about technology and education are a century old. So question, is individualization the right thing to do? It's not sufficient. It should not be sufficient. I would not want anyone to read the book and come away thinking that individualization or personalization is going to be sufficient for education or for using technology to advance our society. I do think that they could come away excited by the prospect of technology, but using it to enable connection. And that can be connection to content, connection to people, connection to a university, connection to a teacher, but thinking about it in that way. And also understanding that every technology has someone who has invested in it. So asking those questions, who is investing? Why are they investing? What does success look like for the investor? That's going to determine how the product gets developed. And that's what you should be thinking about in terms of whether to adopt that EdTech product or not.
Thank you so much, Dr. N. Trumbore, for this thought-provoking and generous conversation today. Your insights into the human story behind education technology and its impact on equity access and the future of higher education have given us a lot to reflect on and carry forward. We are grateful for the time you have taken to unpack the ideas in the teacher, in the machine, and to connect history, policy, and practice in such a clear and engaging way. I am sure our listeners will be thinking differently about AI, online learning, and the role of universities after this discussion. On behalf of Business Talk and our audience, thank you once again for joining us and for the important work you are doing. It's been an absolute privilege to have you with us. Thank you once again.
Thank you once again, and thank you, everyone. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn if you would like to follow up. I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you.